Ever find yourself mesmerized by those underwater documentaries? You know, the ones where divers just seem to glide effortlessly through the water?
Yeah, it's like they've unlocked some secret level of underwater movement.
Totally.
Mhm.
It's almost like they're weightless, dancing with the currents.
It's the holy grail of scuba diving, really.
And the secret to that effortless movement, that underwater grace, buoyancy control.
It's the magic ingredient that separates the clumsy splashers from those graceful gliders we were just talking about.
And that, my friends, is exactly what we're diving deep into today. We're talking all things buoyancy control. How to go from feeling like you're wrestling with the ocean to, well, dancing with it.
Because when you nail buoyancy control, everything changes, less energy wasted, you use less air, and maybe most importantly, you minimize your impact on that beautiful underwater world.
Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's make sure we're all on the same page. Buoyancy. What are we actually talking about here?
Buoyancy, the mystical force that determines whether something floats gracefully on the surface or, plummets to the depths.
Right, like a hot air balloon. Think about it. Pump it full of hot air and whoosh, up it goes.
Yeah.
Positive buoyancy, right?
Exactly. Let that air cool down, though, and, well, it's a slow and steady descent back to Earth. That's negative buoyancy in action.
And buoyancy control, at its core, it's all about finding that sweet spot underwater. Neutral buoyancy.
Where you're not fighting tooth and nail to stay down, not constantly kicking just to avoid a close encounter of the coral reef kind.
Sign me up for that. But on a serious note, there's some actual science behind all this underwater magic.
Right. Oh, absolutely. And it all goes back to our old pal Archimedes and that famous bathtub revelation of his.
Ah, the eureka moment. It was about water displacement. Right.
Spot on. Archimedes' principle, at its core, basically states that the buoyant force acting on an object dunked in a fluid, like, say, a scuba diver in water, is equal to the weight of the fluid that object displaces.
Okay, so for us land dwellers, what does that actually mean?
Simply put, to achieve that coveted neutral buoyancy, you need to displace an amount of water equal to your own weight. And yes, that includes all your fancy scuba gear.
So it's all about striking that perfect balance, our own weight versus the weight of the water we push aside.
Exactly. And here's where things get really interesting. Even the tiniest changes in your body density can tip those scales for better or for worse.
Wait, are you saying that extra donut I had for breakfast could actually mess with my buoyancy?
Every little bit counts. But in all seriousness, this is why understanding the factors that affect your buoyancy, things like your weight, your gear, even the type of air in your scuba tank, is absolutely crucial to mastering it.
So before we even think about getting wet, what's the very first step our listeners should take to set themselves up for buoyancy success?
It all starts with the pre-dive prep, and the most important part of that, making sure you've got your weighting absolutely spot on.
Getting the weight right? Okay, that makes sense. But how do we actually know? Like, how can we be sure we've nailed it?
The pre-dive weight check. It's like a dress rehearsal for your buoyancy, making sure everything fits just right before you hit the underwater runway.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Walk us through it.
So find a spot where you can get in the water fully geared up, right? Ideally, you want to have an empty BCD. And the goal is to be able to float at eye level while taking a normal, comfortable breath.
Got it. So if I'm bobbing along happily at the surface, we're good to go?
You got it. But if you find yourself struggling to stay afloat, or worse, sinking like a stone, then you're going to need to adjust those weights. It might take a little trial and error, but trust me, finding that sweet spot is worth it.
Makes sense. Now, speaking of gear, I'm guessing the type of wetsuit I'm wearing also plays a role in all of this.
Absolutely. A thicker wetsuit, or especially a dry suit, is definitely going to make you more buoyant, and that's because of all that trapped air. It's like wearing a built-in life jacket, but, in a good way, of course.
Okay, so we've got our weight sorted, we're rocking the perfect wetsuit for the conditions, and we're ready to explore. Time for the big plunge. Any tips for a graceful descent? Because I'll admit, sometimes it's less about grace and more about just getting down there.
Yeah, the panicked scramble to the bottom. Definitely not a graceful look. And more importantly, it could actually hurt your ears. The key here is a controlled descent. Think smooth and steady, like a feather drifting on a gentle breeze.
Poetic. I like it.
And remember to equalize early and often as you go down. You want to avoid any ear discomfort. And this is super important. Don't even think about holding your breath to control your descent. Seriously, that can be really dangerous.
Right, because as you go deeper, the pressure changes, and holding your breath can lead to a whole world of problems.
Exactly. Instead, use your BCD to manage that descent rate. Add small bursts of air as you go down, kind of like gently tapping the brakes on a bike. And remember, there's no need to rush. Take it slow and enjoy the ride.
Speaking of feeling in control, the fin pivot, what's that all about?
The fin pivot. It's a really neat way to fine-tune your buoyancy once you reach your desired depth. So picture this. You're kneeling gently on the seabed. Don't worry, we'll talk about protecting the environment in a bit. And you just lift your head. If your weighting is spot on, you should pivot smoothly on your fins, just like a seesaw.
Whoa, so we're aiming for that feeling of perfect balance even when we're submerged.
Exactly. The fin pivot's just a really handy way to check if you've achieved that neutral buoyancy. And once you have, that's when the real magic of scuba diving starts to happen. You can effortlessly glide through the water, minimizing your effort and maximizing, the enjoyment factor.
That sounds incredible. But I imagine maintaining that Zen-like state of neutral buoyancy throughout an entire dive, that takes practice, constant awareness.
You're absolutely right. It's like a dance, constantly making these micro adjustments to stay perfectly balanced in the water.
So what's the secret? How do we become one with the water, buoyancy-wise?
Believe it or not, your breath is your secret weapon. Even the tiniest changes in your breathing can have a huge impact on your buoyancy.
Okay, so we're talking more than just, remembering to breathe down there, right?
Right. It's about using your breath consciously and intentionally. Deep, slow, steady breaths, that's the key. Think of it like meditation in motion. Your lungs, they act like this natural buoyancy compensator. Take a slightly deeper breath, and you'll rise a little. Exhale slowly, and you'll gently descend. It's all about finding that sweet spot and making those subtle adjustments as you go.
So we're not holding our breath down there. We're actively using it to fine-tune our position in the water column, like a secret underwater language almost.
Exactly. And if you need to make, bigger adjustments, that's where your BCD comes into play. Think of your lungs for those subtle shifts, your BCD for the more, shall we say, dramatic moves.
Subtle breathing for micro adjustments, BCD for the bigger moves. Got it. Horizontal trim. What is that and why should we care?
Such a good question. Horizontal trim often gets overlooked, but honestly, it's crucial for both efficiency and being, environmentally conscious. It's about distributing your weight evenly so you're streamlined and balanced in the water.
So instead of swimming head up or dragging my feet, I want to be nice and horizontal, like a scuba diving superhero.
Precisely. Think of like a torpedo or a manta ray gliding effortlessly through the water. That's what we're going for with good horizontal trim.
Makes sense. No one wants to be the scuba equivalent of a wonky shopping cart bumping into everything in sight. But seriously, what are the real benefits of getting our trim sorted?
Well, for starters, good trim reduces drag, and less drag means you're using less energy and less air throughout your dive. Plus, and this is a big one, it helps you protect that delicate marine environment. You're much less likely to accidentally bump into corals or, other marine life. Basically, you become a much more mindful presence underwater.
Right, because even with perfect buoyancy control, accidentally kicking a coral reef is a big no-no. Speaking of which, we've covered descending and, hanging out at depth. But what about the grand finale? How do we make sure we surface safely and, hopefully, gracefully?
The ascent just as important as the descent, if not more so. And once again, it all comes down to a controlled descent rate. We're talking no more than 30 feet per minute, nice and easy. And just like with your descent, use your BCD to manage that buoyancy, releasing air gradually as you ascend.
And never forget that all-important safety stop.
Absolutely crucial. This is where you hit pause on your ascent for a few minutes, usually around 15 feet below the surface. This gives your body time to release any excess nitrogen that's built up during the dive. Think of it like a little decompression pit stop for your body.
I like it. A decompression pit stop.
Yeah.
Sounds like a good time to practice our hovering skills, really put that perfect buoyancy to the test.
Exactly. A safety stop should be one of the most relaxing parts of your dive. You're almost there. Practice hovering effortlessly without using your hands to balance or, needing to touch the bottom. It's the perfect opportunity to solidify that awesome buoyancy control you've been working on.
Okay, so far so good. But even with the best intentions, I have a feeling even seasoned divers make mistakes from time to time. What should our listeners be watching out for?
You're right. Everyone makes mistakes, even the pros. One of the most common, I would say, is being overweighted. Or underweighted, for that matter. It can happen to anyone, especially if you're diving with new gear in different conditions. You know how it is. That's why doing that pre-dive weight check, it's like hitting the reset button each time you dive. It only takes a few minutes and can make a world of difference.
Makes total sense.
Yeah.
What about other common slip-ups? I'm all for learning from other people's shall we say, learning experiences.
Another incredibly common one, especially among newer divers, is relying on kicking their fins to control their depth. And I get it, it feels intuitive, right? But remember, those fins, they're for propulsion, not buoyancy. They're there to move you forward, not up and down. Rely on your BCD and those subtle breathing techniques we talked about earlier.
Right. Fins for swimming, breath, and BCD for fine-tuning our depth. And I'm guessing holding your breath is still a big no-no.
Huge no-no. As we talked about before, holding your breath, especially during ascent, that's a recipe for disaster. Always, always breathe continuously and evenly throughout your dive, no matter what surprises you might encounter down there.
Got it. So to recap, we're looking at breath control, BCD management, and remembering those all-important pre-dive checks. It's a lot to juggle.
It might seem overwhelming at first, but honestly, like any skill buoyancy control, it becomes second nature with practice. And once you've nailed those basics, well, that's when the real fun begins, taking your skills to that next level.
Ooh, advanced buoyancy control. Now you're speaking my language. Tell us more.
There's a whole world of techniques to explore, as you become more comfortable and confident in the water. Remember how we talked about using your breath to make those subtle buoyancy adjustments?
Yeah, like a secret underwater language.
Well, imagine mastering that to the point where you can practically control your depth with just your breath, barely even touching your BCD. That's the beauty of breath control mastery.
Wow, that sounds incredible. What does it feel like to have that level of control underwater?
It's pure freedom, really. You become this neutrally buoyant creature moving effortlessly through the water with, the slightest breath. And because you're not kicking up a fuss, you start to notice the tiniest little creatures, the smallest details of the reef. It's like, how do I describe it?
Like underwater meditation, maybe?
Yeah. Meditation, but you're surrounded by coral reefs instead of, houseplants.
Okay, now I'm really starting to get FOMO here.
Yeah.
But I imagine it takes a certain, dedication, maybe even a little obsession to reach that level of mastery. What would you say to our listeners who are eager to level up their buoyancy control, but maybe feeling a little intimidated by the whole thing?
Honestly, don't be afraid to start small. Mastery, it comes from consistency, and a genuine love for the process. Find a controlled environment like a pool or maybe a nice shallow sandy area and just practice those micro adjustments with your breath.
So you're saying we don't have to wait for that once-a-year dive trip. Even just practicing in a pool can make a difference.
Absolutely. And if you can, find a dive buddy, someone who, shares your passion for perfecting those buoyancy skills. You can provide each other with feedback, encouragement, maybe even a little friendly competition.
I love that. Turning skill practice into a fun outing with a friend. So we've covered a lot of ground today, from the basic principles of buoyancy to those, dare I say, Jedi-level advanced techniques. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners before we release them back into the wild world of scuba diving?
Here's the thing about buoyancy control. It's not just about, checking boxes on a scuba skills checklist. It's about transforming your entire diving experience, really. When you're no longer fighting to control your buoyancy, you move from this place of effort to a place of ease. You conserve energy, use less air, and maybe most importantly, you become this more mindful, less impactful presence in this, incredible, fragile underwater world that we're so lucky to explore.
It's almost like going from, tourist to ambassador of the reef.
Exactly. You're able to observe marine life without disturbing it, glide through delicate coral formations without, leaving a trace. You become a guest in this amazing ecosystem, and honestly, that changes everything.
Beautifully put. And on that note, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today and hopefully ignited a spark to, dive in, pun very much intended, and really hone those buoyancy skills.
I have no doubt they'll be amazed at the difference it makes in their diving.
And as always, we want to hear from you. What resonated with you from today's deep dive? What are your biggest buoyancy control challenges? Or maybe you've had some, underwater victories. Share your thoughts, questions, whatever's on your mind. Let's keep this conversation going. Until next time, happy and buoyant diving, everyone.